So I'm going to actually divide this talk into two parts. The first part are reflections on just my own reflections on the context that I've been working on which is India, and what has surrounded us in these 3 decades of practice for me. And in the second half, I'm going to show you some selected projects, which I hope resonate in terms of some of the observations I make. The 3 or 4 themes that you should just keep in the back of your mind. One is this sort of idea of our sphere of concern and our sphere of influence. I think this is very important, and how they intersect, and how we as architects can make it intersect, as citizens can make it intersect. The second one is the idea of absolute solutions versus designing for transitions. And I think this is something we are very much captured in India today, and I think it's worth clarifying. And the third is, of course, implicit in all of this, the agency of architecture and of design. So I think perhaps, in my view, the most important issues in the coming years, and I'm sort of jumping right into this as an observation, that besides the disruptions that we all know that globalization has caused, it is the drive of capital that, as we know it today, the way it's playing out, is going to be detrimental to the values we've brought to bear on our environment. So capitalism as an idea is valid, of course, for many reasons, but the impact it's having on the environment, I think we have to interrogate a little more seriously. I've spoken at length about architecture and the architecture of impatient capital, and I'll touch upon that. But I think architecture is becoming too autonomous from its context and from society to be useful. And it's clear in my mind that this free-running capitalism will never help resolve this inherent contradiction about, for example, our aspirations to create green buildings or socially inclined human environments. Because while we are simultaneously pandering to capital just for our survival, it undermines the values that we might want to bring. And this contradiction is critical for us to understand more carefully. As Wolfgang Streeck in his book titled How Capitalism Fails says, capitalism can no longer turn private vice into public benefits. Its existence as a self-reproducing, sustainable, predictable, and legitimate social order has ended. Capitalism has become more capitalist than good for it. And I think it's worth sort of flagging that out. While I was preparing this talk 3 weeks ago, I was reading Ravish Kumar's Free Voice Democracy in India. And I was so happy to hear that he got the Magsaysay Award, but I had actually pulled out this quotation before that happened. And I just want to quote him because I think, again, these are, I think, good flags for all of us to put forward, just so that we can kind of use them as benchmarks. And just to quote him, he says, "From the time privatization gathered pace in India, leading to a corporate culture, people from the corporate world have almost completely disappeared from democratic participation. There are very few exceptions." And that's the reason I'm here, because I think this is one of the exceptions. "Scarcely anybody ventures out of his or her firm. It's as if anybody who enters the corporate world is out of the democratic setup, leading to a lifestyle that prompts him or her to value democracy less and less. They start imagining India can only be saved by a dictatorship, naturally a market-friendly dictatorship. Although privatization was presented as the answer to many of democracy's ills, it has enfeebled the very idea of democracy. The corporate world has not provided a flip to a democratic participation because it has formed a nexus with the political class, and they're working together sometimes and most often against the interests of the people. So whether it's environment or many other things. They can do as they please, acquire land, raise a mountain here, create a situation where farmers are driven to digging holes and standing in them for weeks to demand fair price for their land, but to no avail. The more privatization increases, the more democratic spaces will shrink." And this is the whole point of his book. But I mean, the reason I'm bringing up all this is that, I'm not a political scientist, I'm not a journalist who's sort of following these ideas. But I think as architects and people who, whether we are patrons or the builders, all this has an amazing bearing on what we do, how we pick up the problem. And that's why the context in which we build, the context and how we understand the context becomes absolutely critical. And of course, this has huge implications on space. As Charles Correa wrote, today the amount of urban space one controls is directly proportionate to one's status or income. It has no connection to actual family size. In fact, poorer people more often have larger families. This space differential, therefore, cannot be justified in human terms, but only economic ones. And of course, this has a massive bearing on the way we mold space. And equity is not only a quantitative measure, it has a subjective dimension, that of access, who has access to what. And sometimes just the illusion of access is useful. And I think, again, the built environment can inform that process if we flag that out as one of our aspirations. And so, the landscape that we are experiencing today, and this is where the issue of transition comes in, is a landscape of transition. We've moved from socialism to capitalism, but for decades we're going to transition from socialism to capitalism. These are not neat transitions that you wake up and you have a policy and a bill is passed in Parliament and you say we are a capitalist society. And where it plays out most acutely is the built environment, the transition. And so how can we not design for transition, because we always think in terms of absolute solutions. And of course, this image is emblematic of much of this, because here, I think values then begin to shrink and architecture becomes an autonomous object. And this becomes then the architecture of impatient capital, because it becomes architecture that has to be realized very quickly, because capital is inherently impatient. And therefore, it determines the materials, it determines the way buildings are made. And here I want to, and I'll come back to this image in much more detail, it's from a project, and I want to quote Martha Chen, who is a world authority on informal economies. She grew up in India, teaches now in Harvard, and for me this image is emblematic of her ideas. And she talks about this in the context of economy, and to quote her, she says, "What is needed most fundamentally is a new economic paradigm, a model of a hybrid economy that embraces the traditional and the modern, the small scale and the big scale, the informal and the formal. What is needed is an economic model that allows the smallest units and the least powerful workers to operate alongside the largest units and the most powerful workers and players." And this hybridity is what then transitions become about, that you're beginning to accommodate people for a generation, sometimes for two, and therefore the question for us as designers is, what is the implication on the built form? And I think by extension, the discussions we have so easily about sustainability comes down often to a chemical or a mechanical fix to a problem perpetuated and driven by a green industry. So we make these big dumb glass boxes, and then we have better sealants and more efficient fans, and then we get points for that from the LEED certification. So this is a much more fundamental problem that we need to look at. And the crucial question is that a lot of the discussion about sustainability and what is a green building doesn't have two dimensions in terms of what it evaluates. And one dimension is spatial articulation. Is the space efficiently articulated or not? So you make an inefficient space and then you fix it. And the other is the human dimension, which is there's no metric to measure that. And so in a sense, we have a very over-objective, devoid of this kind of human dimension when we talk about sustainability. And I think that becomes an interesting question to interrogate. So then, therefore, the question becomes the idea of the context. And, as architects, and we often look at the context, I believe, in rather narrow terms. The context is, okay, the climate of the place, what's the geography that you're located in, what might be the local materials. Some of us might be a little more ambitious and talk about culture, or we might excavate the histories of the site. But yet, it's often site-specific, or let me say at most, some territory-specific. The real question is, what is the context of the context? And how do you nestle the context in its context? And what might that mean? And I think that becomes the productive way to look at it, because otherwise we get stuck in the idea of binaries. And this is a very easy way to describe the world. It's a very useful way to describe the world through these binaries. But the binaries actually don't result in the hybridities, because the binaries are not about synthesis. The binaries are actually about pulling apart, because then you reside in one of those binaries or the others. Whereas design is about synthesis. Design is about how do you blur these binaries? How do you get away from an environment and a world through better spatial arrangements where these binaries don't have to exist? And so this synthesis of binaries, I think, is at the heart of design. And I think for us in India, it's a challenge that, is right up front for us to face. And so I'll just go back to the idea of the context of the context. And so I think, how does an architect then construct the appropriate narratives for the production of the built environment? The idea of the context is something, as I said, we've traditionally constructed. But you have to employ other meta-narratives to clarify the context in which this context operates. As designers, I would argue, and I think for all professionals, it is the space of constructing these meta-narratives that you can intersect the context with its context. Now, this is a lecture in itself, but I can just give you some examples of what are meta-narratives. And I think they describe a range of emergent conditions that fundamentally challenge our forms of, as designers, when we are operating in this condition. So rapid geo-economic integration is a meta-narrative. So the context you're working in, how does it respond to those flows? We talk about globalization, but how do we actually bring that into a description that might be more useful to us as designers? Uneven spatial development that results from it. Inequity, for example, the whole notion of inequity in the built environment is clearly one of the biggest issues. The idea of shifting demographies, which is through migration, displacement, these have huge bearings on the way the built environment works. And so you can't isolate a context from these larger meta-narratives that play in it. And of course, this leads to other questions of the state reconstruction and neoliberalism, the notion of these simultaneous transitions that I was speaking about earlier, where you have these mutated forms of democracy when you have these transitions, because it's not a clear transition from one political, economic ideology to the other. You go through the transition for decades sometimes, and even then what might result at the end is not what you had anticipated when you made those decisions of policy. And so unless as designers one is aware of that, whether it's product design or whether it's architecture, where architecture is much bigger bearing, this idea of nestling the context in its context becomes incredibly important. Similarly, Sibel Bozdogan, who's a Turkish scholar, she talked about social versus aesthetic modernity. And she argued that in many countries like India, Turkey, which she was studying, Africa, Latin America, actually aesthetic modernity arrived in these places before the social modernization process. And often by charismatic architects or by patrons, in our case like Nehru, who made a particular decision, and there was a whole generation of architects that followed that call. And here, aesthetic modernity arrived before an independent bourgeois, industrialization, capital markets, etc. So you have a kind of disjuncture that you have an aesthetic and you have a societal modernization that's lagging behind. But you have the aesthetic, whereas in Europe, aesthetic modernity came out of a whole social modernization process. And so they mapped onto each other more equally. And that's why we despair about the shape and state our modern buildings are. People can't relate to them, all rightly so. So it's through these kinds of more complicated readings, I think you can be informed much more squarely about how to operate in these contexts. And of course, from that comes this question, I think, in India, of the massive scale of the informalization of our cities. That is, when cities are constructed out of the formal purview of the state, what happens? And I call this the Kinetic City. It's a city that is a twitching organism. It is not a city defined by its architecture. This 5 stages of squatting is the DNA of our cities. This guy in the image is in the 3rd stage of squatting, where, he's got comfortable, he's got a constituency around him, he's probably bribed his way into the system, and then when the monsoon comes, he fortifies himself, and at the end of the year, he's part of the paraphernalia of the city. So it's called the 5 stages of squatting. It's this kind of incrementalism that leads to the making of the city, or the way we use public space, this wonderful little street in Girgaon somewhere, and for Ganpati, it becomes a community hall. But in 10 days, it's reversed, and the street goes back to anonymity. So this notion of reversibility is very much part of the way public space is articulated, or this wonderful Indian game that the British invented, cricket, the Maidans, it becomes a venue for weddings, and you see the pitch no one touches because it's sacred, and in the morning it disappears and you have the cricket pitch again. Space becomes elastic, it's reversible, it's appropriated and reappropriated and deappropriated. There's an ephemeral quality to it, and the reversibility becomes very, very important. Similarly, the kinetic city, or the landscape of the transitionary, is very important to note, and it's not even restricted to India. I can give you 300 cases from around the world, and it's an urbanism created by those outside the elite domains of the formal modernity of the state, and what Ravi Sundaram refers to as a pirate modernity that slips under the laws of the city to simply survive without any conscious attempt of creating a counterculture, so to speak. And in fact, flux is the most important aspect of the city, and I call it the kinetic city because here the binaries completely blur, because the formal city and the informal city coexist, and they need each other even for their identification and their referencing. And in fact, architecture is not even the spectacle of the kinetic city. And that's why there's so little invested by society. It's beginning to happen more in architecture. Our spaces are made by the spectacles of the festival. So it's no coincidence that when Raghuveer Singh did his final book on Mumbai, he didn't put a building or a landscape on the cover. He put the Ganesh immersion, because this becomes the spectacle of the city. And every city needs a spectacle. The Petronas Towers is the spectacle of Kuala Lumpur. We don't have that. The Rajabai Tower was the spectacle of Mumbai. But here, architecture is not the spectacle of the city. It doesn't even comprise the single dominant image of the city. In contrast, these festivals, all the way from Durga Puja to Navratri, Ganesh Chaturthi, etc., there are no static or permanent mechanisms to encode this spectacle. Here, the memory of the city is an enacted process, a temporal moment as opposed to buildings that contain the public memory or static images of this sort of as a permanent entity. The kinetic city, in a sense, recycles the static city to create new spectacles. Versus, this is exactly the opposite of these landscapes of impatient capital, which are very brittle forms. Don't worry, this is no place in the world, it's a collage. So the terrains like Shanghai, Dubai, that make the arrival of capital frictionless become the attracted places for capital, and these are very brittle forms, and they're driven by vendors because they can be built very quickly. Architecture almost has no place in it. Parametrics, when architects begin using computer software to twist and turn buildings or make them go higher, but the human being is not center of this imagination. So these are the landscapes of impatient capital. So how do you extend this then to create an even broader understanding of the context? And so this is a question that I've been asking about India, and this is going to be a book that will be out, I hope, by March or April. What is urban? How do we look at the urban in India? And I'm just going to give you a small glimpse. In India, there are three criteria the government uses to define what becomes urban or what is a town, and therefore by extension what gets a municipality and what gets services. One criteria is it should have a population of over 5,000 people. The second is it has a density of 400 people per square kilometer, and the third is it has to have 75% of its male population should be in non-agricultural employment. Now, why only male population, and today's day why only agricultural employment is very bizarre. This is a kind of redundancy in some ways. So if you look at the criteria, this is what urban India looks like, the big cities, the small cities. If I just take the criteria of the number of people, 5,000 people per settlement, this is my reading of urban India. So what we've done is we've taken the census data from 2012 down to the village level and spatialized it. And you get a completely different reading of urban India. If I take the criteria of density of 400 people per square kilometer, Kashmir to Calcutta is the world's biggest megacity. It is 200 miles by 1,000 something miles. It's a completely different reading of urban India because you get this kind of pattern. Now, why is this important? Now, if you look at 75% of the male, the criteria of 78% of the male population in agriculture, this is not urban because everyone there is employed in agriculture. And so this is important because we are getting completely wrong readings of what is urban India. And so if we accept the idea that this is urban India, we are designing a rural-urban landscape. We are not making the densities that we are trying to make in cities like Mumbai. The tyranny of images has driven the narrative of urban form in India. We look at the mega cities and we try to make those cities in that policy. In fact, all the policies of Mumbai get replicated in every town. This is the tyranny of images, whereas you need a fully different imagination if you have to look at an urban-rural landscape. And therefore, understanding even the basics of what these cities mean. The research is showing us two things. The research is showing us that India officially has 7,528 towns that are qualified as census towns and things. But our reading is that India has 32,000 towns. That means there are over 10, 15, there are towns we have mapped that are 160,000 people yet being run by a panchayat. And so this is completely bizarre, which means they don't have hospitals, schools, clinics, none of the infrastructure that the government should be providing. That is the real urban time bomb that we are sitting on. Sitting in Mumbai, we think all the problems are focused here, whether it's a freeway on the sea or there's flyovers. This is the least of the problem in India. The urban time bomb is the 27,000 cities that are not being even imagined as cities. And they're going to be a public health nightmare if something explodes, and it's going to. So this question, and the other thesis that's coming out of this is India is basically, if you use these criteria, 40% urban for 6 months of the year and 60% urban for the other 6 months of the year, which means 300 million people are in a state of flux. And so how do you design for flux? And that becomes important. And that's where the reading of the Kinetic City, etc., becomes interesting. And that's what led us to studying the Kumbh Mela and looking at this incredible megacity through interdisciplinary team from the various schools at Harvard University. So looking at it through all the lenses that were possible: business, religion, technology, health, governance, etc. And of course, you guys all know about this, so I'm not going to go into details. From this watery terrain emerges a whole city on the sandbanks, a city where 7 million people lived there for 55 days and another 100 million visited. It's all rather mind-boggling, but it's on a grid. It's one of the most robust cities I've seen. That's a before and after image from the same spot when we visited. It's not a pop-up city, it's a deliberate mega city, but it's an ephemeral mega city. And it addresses this question. It actually takes the idea of flux to like its absolute limit to challenge us in terms of how we can deal with it. It's on a perfect grid. Every road goes across a bridge, so it's absolutely robust. If one bridge gets clogged, you have 10 alternate ways to have mobility through the city. And what is interesting is it has a temporary or a transitionary governance systems. Actually, a lot of our cities, more than the buildings that we inherit in terms of permanence, it's the governance system that we inherit that is too permanent, and often it's not even relevant. Take the case of Mumbai, where we should have had a mayoral system decades ago, but we are stuck with a particular kind of system which doesn't give attention to the city. Here what happens is, on a changing scale, it's top down for the first half of the year when they're planning it, chief minister giving instructions, people reporting to him. That's what this diagram shows you. And then it goes to the divisional commissioner. So 6 months before the Mela, the divisional commissioner becomes in charge. He reports only to 2 people, and then he has all these guys. And then during the festival, the Mela Adhikari becomes in charge, and he reports to 2 or 3 people that are his superior, and then he can go out to subcontractors if he wants. So it's also a governance system that works on a time scale and is in transition. It's ephemeral. It moves across the scale depending. Now imagine if we had a system like that in Mumbai, where if there was a chance of a flood, the whole set of hierarchy shifted in a way that you could respond to it, and you're not stuck with a hierarchy that's much slower in normal times. So it's lessons like this that we need to bring to our imagination, even through governance. I'm just giving you 2 examples. Otherwise, we are going to build redundant urban form, which is going to lock us into permanent solutions. So the question then becomes, are we making permanent solutions for temporary problems? And I think that's a very important question for architects to ask. And we extended this research into a mapping of ephemeral urbanism, which is a taxonomy. So these were the 300 cases we studied, looking at markets, religion, extraction, which is mining towns, celebrations. And it became a book, which is a complementary book to the Kumbh Mela. It also became a Biennale installation, which was very interesting. But here we ask the question, does permanence matter? And are we making permanent solutions for temporary problems? And of course, it's an exhibition and research that's traveling. So this is in Munich, where when it went to Munich, the local architects there added the Oktoberfest because they felt it fell in the rubric of imagining how you could have temporary installations within a city. And what was interesting there was because of the Turkish population and the carpet tradition, they actually wove these cities as carpets. So you could sit in the exhibition and actually understand how these temporary cities work. And that's Burning Man, which some of you might know about. So we made drawings. We basically tried to bring it into the jargon of architecture. So what I've spoken to you about, and I can go on for another 2 hours, is the sphere of my concern. I'm concerned about these things. And a lot of us are concerned about poverty and climate change. We sit in our living rooms with friends and we are very passionate about all of this, but we get up in the morning frustrated because actually our sphere of influence is very small. And so this imbalance between our spheres of concerns as citizens and our sphere of influence is, I think, something we need to calibrate, we need to interrogate, we need to discuss, and we need to collectively bring together. Otherwise, it becomes another binary. And however good we might feel for a few hours in the day, we are not going to, all our training is going to go to waste. And so for me, this intersection is very critical. And what I'm going to now show you is projects, but also other observations that have helped me make that intersection, I believe. We are stuck with absolute solutions. We make absolute solutions. The Pradhan Mantri Ayojan, we are going to do 3 million, 2 million houses. These are absolute solutions, that you're going to build them in a factory, then you build them in cheap land. They lie empty there for decades. On the paper, you build 2 million houses. It means that, because these are absolute solutions. Opening up land with service, allowing incremental investments, people doing sites and services, building their own houses. It might not give you cohesive urban form necessarily, but it will solve the problem. Those are transitionary solutions. The aesthetics makes us do absolute solutions because we want to control the aesthetic. We have to challenge this if we have to make our spheres of concern and our spheres of influence intersect. So for me, books becomes an instrument of advocacy. So advocacy is one way of doing it. And for me, I think Parmesh referred to some of these books I did with Sharda Dwivedi, many of them with other friends. Some of them are catalogs, some of them are not academic, but these become instruments of advocacy. And so for a lot of the young architects here, don't worry about doing advocacy. Sometimes it doesn't pay your bills. If you can just produce the instruments of advocacy for other people who can do it, as architects, you're playing a big role. Otherwise, often you go into advocacy and your base skills, which is about making instruments of advocacy, whether it's documenting the Art Deco district or whether it's documenting the regional plan and doing something with it, those instruments are as critical. And so in the case of Mumbai with Sharda, we did these books, and I believe they were instruments of advocacy for getting the legislation through, and it led to, with Shyam Chainani and others, to the first legislation because it was about documentation, and then that led us to advocacy. We began to look at what is the Fort District, why was nothing happening there. The question we asked ourselves was, what are contemporary engines that can drive the process of conservation? But if we hadn't made those instruments of advocacy, we couldn't have asked these questions. And of course, it led to the art district, many other things. But it also has a place for architecture. So this is the Prince of Wales Museum. We landed up then making very gentle inserts in them without compromising the gardens, because as this became more and more an art district, the museum got a lot of traction. It needed facilities. So then how do you bring contemporary sensibilities into it in a reversible way? So everything we did there, like the visitor center, it's reversible. Another generation might have another way of doing this, but it becomes an intervention. It becomes a transitionary solution. The other thing I learned from these exhibitions and the research is we take the client as one entity. Actually, the client is a complex entity you have to unpack. You have a patron, you have an operational client, and you have a user. The patron is a person who commissions it, who has a vision, it might be the chief minister of a state, it might be the chairman of a corporation, someone who has a vision of what they want you to represent. The operational client is the college building committee or the in-house engineer in a corporation, etc. And the users are the users. If you differentiate this, you begin to understand what you're doing, because the context in which each one of these parts of the client in this unpacked kind of imagination have completely different aspirations. So your task becomes difficult, but I think the end results become much richer. So this unpacking of the client into the patron, now in a single family house or even a single family house or a weekend house or things like that, it actually collapses. I mean, except for the couple who might have some differences, usually the patron, the user, and the operational client sort of collapse into one. And so therefore the direction and the aspiration is very clear. And the other thing that you have to think about is we often think about the practice of architecture, but what is the architecture of practice? What is the model by which your profession or your practice is actually organized? Whether you communicate directly with craftsmen, are you a corporate kind of model? All of that becomes really critical because the protocols and the processes change completely. This is what all of us deal with, boutique homes and private individual architecture of indulgence. This is 1% of the built environment. And then you have advocacy, NGOs, self-initiated project, research, alternate practice. So that must be about another 5 or 10%. The bulk is this, which is the mainstream, institutional, corporate, developers, government, faith-based, akshardhams, vipassana. Architects are not even involved in this stuff, And so if you want to make a change in this country, do all the other things, but try to change the mainstream. If you change the mainstream, I think we'll have a big impact on our environment. And so this is the School of Architecture in Ahmedabad, CEPT, where I studied. And here the patron is the chairman of the Ahmedabad Education Society, the operational client is the building committee, all of whom were senior to me in college, so treated me like a little punk, telling me what to do. And the users were the students who were very enjoyable to interact with. It's also designed by Doshi, so here the context, therefore, if I was designing this in the fort area, I have a different set of propositions. But this is a piece of modern heritage, so it is a conservation zone. So here, the context, it is conservation. Besides my own personal associations, which are mind-blowing, having spent 5 years of my life here and studied architecture, it was also about building in a very sacred, modern context. And so here they get differentiated. And so it was a whole different process in terms of protocol. It meant many presentations to students, to faculty. It meant getting everybody's inputs, getting abused by people, getting up people who were upset that you were building there, etc. This was a site we were given in a master plan that Christopher Benninger did. These are existing buildings. They planned to modify that. That's why they put it on axis. So it's on axis to Doshi's buildings, but it also completes the quad. And it is a very difficult proposition because they gave us a program that needed 6 floors for a library. And this building was very difficult to do. And we said that we are not going to go 1 inch above any of Doshi's buildings. We took all the datum lines from the contemporary historic buildings and matched it. But what we did was we went 3 floors below the ground as a way to respect that. And that was a very difficult project to do technically, but it made sense because in Ahmedabad you also got thermal advantages by going down, etc. But the question is, how do you enjoy a library 3 floors below the ground? It becomes a challenge in itself. And then this was just this was the model I took, and I had the side covered and I presented to everyone, and they said, it's impossible that you're using up all the area and the requirements we wanted. So we let them get really upset about all of that for a long time, and then I took out the side of the model and they saw 3 more floors. So at least that thing about the program we got over. So it's a building that's like these Chinese dolls that nestle, or Japanese dolls that nestle into each other. It's 3 buildings. The outer building is the shell that modulates the climate, and inner building is the programs, the reading rooms, and then within that there is a building which goes down 3 or 4 floors, which is the book stacks. The sectional logic of each part of the building is different. So the outer shell, they're 5-meter slab levels. The next one is 3.5 meters, and the inner one is 2.4 meters, because 8 feet is the maximum you can get a book. So it's 3 different buildings nestled into each other with a completely different sectional logic. So if you took a sectional model, that's what it is. This is the outer shell. and 4.5 meters down is a courtyard which brings light right down into the building, and those are the reading rooms upstairs with a big roof that goes over it. And that's when the louvers are closed. It's a facade of louvers. So that's what it looks like when you're on the ground. It's a base where students can sit. There are bridges that take you in. And these louvers can all be manipulated for light, air, depending on the climate and who needs to do it. And that's how it sits in scale with the rest of the building. So it doesn't begin to overpower them in spite of this large program. And that's as you go. There are bridges. This is where the light goes down. These are carrels. The color of the concrete gets lighter as you go. So this is exactly the ground line outside, which is a dark concrete, and then it becomes very light so that it allows the reflectivity of the light within. So this is a corporate project in Hyderabad. It's for KMC, hot climate. And of course here, again, you have a corporate, chairman, and then the client, etc. And so this is the site in Cyberabad. And they kind of are high-tech infrastructure, so they have a control room where they monitor all their trucks and all of that, and they wanted a glass building, and they had all these photographs they showed me, and I went to Hyderabad, and that was the Telangana riot time, and everything had a fishing net. And I found that in Hyderabad, when you went to a vendor for curtain glazing, they gave you choices of fishing nets so that no one could throw stones on your building, and you could match the color to the glass, and they gave you hooks and stainless steel fixture details. It was all part of the kit of part. And it made me think that, these images of globalization, so to speak, just take over this is the tyranny of images that I was talking about. So we came up with a building that's a 5-floor high garden, but it's not a green wall where you stick pots on the wall, but it's a performative facade which through evaporative cooling cools the building within. So there's a misting system in the plants. The building is 3-4 feet away. You can open it, you can cool it. We didn't get a LEED certificate because we didn't seal our windows, but they said, let's go ahead. And I think it really operates very well. And so every facade then is a different pattern. And every facade has different plants. So like Aloco-bound patterns that people do, you can do different patterns with the plant. We grew them in a nursery here in Chembur. We tested them out. We've transported them. And of course, the clients, this was also impatient capital in a nice way. They wanted to inaugurate the building, so the cows came in, the pujas happened, and we said we need 2 years to grow the facade. And the reason we needed 2 years is the mold is the expensive thing, and this small contractor said, if I have to buy too many molds, then it's uneconomical. So if you give me 2 years, I'll make the panels slowly so that we can, and women were employed. It had a large anodizing tank. These were the bricks that we bought. So they're very impure, but we wanted the impurity because we didn't want a glistening. And this was the one mold where the water system sits in that. And they molded, they're very small panels which were made by 1 or 2 people. They ground it, cleaned it, got the welding off it. Women were handling the anodizing. They're very light panels. They look very bulky. They were stacked, and when there were enough panels ready, a small tempo came, and they went to site, and the same 2 guys just fitted the panels on the building. And when the panels were ready, the plants were grown, and the misting system worked, and it cooled the building. And the plants were all in hydroponic trays, so it's very minimal water, but this is more for effect, for just cooling and just, when it's a particularly hot day. And you can modulate it depending on which plants are where. And the glass is all the conference rooms, so when the misting happens, the glass of the conference rooms also get cleaned, or you feel on a hot day you're sitting in the conference room but it's raining outside. So it's psychologically very nice, lots of lemongrass, the water is recycled, and every facade has different plants, and you go back in the summer, you don't recognize the building, and it's a changing facade, and that's how the water drips when the misting system is on. And the shadow of the plants become the ornament, and they begin to have a changing pattern on the common circulation areas, and that's the world outside, so you might as well shield it off. And so it becomes a woolly monster. You have to give it a haircut, it goes back. It's a very dynamic kind of facade. And the parking is on a podium. The podium also gets used as a social space. And so even sectionally, it has courtyards and atriums and an auditorium. So it's not a dumb box, but it's very carefully molded within, although from the outside it looks like a taut facade. And these are just some of the different plants that sort of grow there. That's what some of the atrium spaces look like. They're controlled. They're not humongous atriums because those are not economical in terms of air conditioning. And that building got a LEED certificate. That's next to us. because they had all the right sealants and the right fans. And that just made the case that, like the walkie-talkie building in London that actually melted a car on the road with a LEED certificate, that this is the contradiction in how we are trying to fix the problem of sustainability, because the public space, the human dimension, many of these things are not taken into account. We are trying to map this building now. It was intuitive. This wasn't scientific. It was pure intuition. I just want to make that clear. And that's what the space is in there. Now I go back to this image. This young intern from Panama in our office took this image. And it made me think about many things. These guys are the heroes of the building. Sanjay Prakash, who's a good friend, he said, "You've created green jobs." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "What I mean by that is the image of the corporation depends on the poorest paid employees of the corporation." So suddenly these guys get empowered in a completely different way. They can walk on these catwalks free, meaning they don't have to take anybody's permission. They can walk past the chairman's office. They can walk past a meeting. People can put a blind down. There are blinds there, but they don't do it. So you create an empathy in the process, because the lowest, this is Martha Chen's quote, that is, how do the lowest paid workers and the highest paid workers actually coexist? And I think in many ways, and we didn't design, this is default. Talking to people, we learned this. So it wasn't something I said, we're going to design it such that the lowest workers and the highest workers can see. But they become friends. It's amazing when you go there, the stories you hear. Someone's forgotten their wedding anniversary. They quickly give them a bouquet of flowers, so they're saved when they go home. They catch butterflies for children who need them for biology. There's an amazing empathy, but there's also amazing social connection that these workers have. I'm going to show you the only project that we've done in Europe. It's in Basel. It's for a company called Novartis. It's the lab of the future that they wanted. And we were among many architects. It's on the Rhine. It's a fantastic master plan that Vittorio Lumpugnani did. That's the Rhine. That's their campus. Vasella, who was their chairman, loved architecture, so he got architects from all over the world. We were the most recent to do it. This was an interesting building where I felt, it's our first building in Europe, but I felt if I hadn't grown up and worked in Mumbai, I would have never done what we did. And here's my story, which might be of interest to all of you. All of us who struggle with bylaws and by making loopholes and trying to do that, this is a good example. So this is the footprint that every big architect around the world got this footprint. They put 2 cores, lifts, elevators, duct, shafts, everything in 2 cores, put the labs in between, put the scientists around. These poor creatures in the lab had no views, no light, no sun. It was very efficient. We thought this was bizarre, so we challenged it. The building got delayed by 3 months, but the client was very open, and we said, this is stupid. What we should do is get a full floor plate. So we disaggregated all the shafts, we disaggregated the circulation, and we said, you'll get a clear footplate, but you'll get much more social interaction because people have to go across they'll have to intersect with each other and not be isolated. So I think that social dimension that I've been talking about, I think we get sensitized to it, so we shouldn't forget it. So we managed, this was a huge victory, and we managed to get this. Then again, this was the envelope we were given by the guidelines. Every big architect did that. We challenged that and we said, why should the labs, which need 5 meters, have the same height as the offices, which need 2.4 meters? So let's actually stack up more offices, which means we'll save on the FSI, which means then we can do courtyards within the building. And then again, you can get social interaction. You can use them as greenhouses to heat the building, to cool the building. After much heeing and hawing, they agreed to that. So this is the only building on that campus of 28 buildings that has broken away from those 2 very strict parameters. But I think it gave us a much richer building. So that's the building, that's the labs, that's the courtyard. You enter, it's a green wall where scientists can go and write up their findings. And then you have these half levels, so you can see people can interact and actually see down to 2 levels. And in the middle of it, with Gunther Woh, who's a Zurich-based landscape architect, we created a garden. And the facade is it has 28 species which register every few weeks a different plant that blooms. So sometimes some burn, so it becomes a register of the seasons. These are the offices virtually feel like they're sitting in the garden. There's no glass between it. The meeting rooms are all these decks that you see all over. This is how you look at the Rhine. These are the labs designed by Toshiko Mori. But the labs always have gardens that you can come out of the lab, you can be doing your interaction. The garden becomes the center of all the meetings. These are the half levels. The meeting areas are in the gardens. They actually have televisions or screens where you can actually have a conference and feel you're completely lost. Those are all meeting decks. And of course, this was early images. This is now very thick as a forest which goes up to those skylights. And it actually becomes a greenhouse in the winter, so it can actually keep the place warm, and therefore it becomes. And of course, this is completely leads with geothermal, very complicated technology, but this assists bringing all those costs down tremendously. But more importantly, it creates a social interaction because people see each other, they go down half a step, they meet people. The circulation is so complicated in a positive way that people actually interact with each other, and that's what it sort of looks like at night. So what I've shown you so far is how we take global programs and we localize it to the place. And I think that is very, very important, because otherwise you get implants that have arrived from Shanghai or Dubai and they just land on our territory. So how do you localize global programs like corporate offices or labs and things that are not, you can't go to our traditions so much to look at them. But how do you also inversely take local programs, which are things for the slums, a community toilet, low-cost housing, and how do you not make caricatures of those which are localized? And how do you kind of make a global lesson which resonates for many other parts of the world also? Because I mean, those aspirations we often misread. We think if it's poor people there, let's evoke the village, or something. Our references become completely crazy. In today's world, that's a complete mistake. So we got very interested, and I'm still very interested. This is another research project we're working on, is just sanitation. What does sanitation mean? Why is sanitation so out of our heads, as architects? And I took this image accidentally, and I always describe it when I was downloading this on my computer, where this boy, this is Dharavi, going off to school, white socks, tie, white shirt, smile on his face. He's probably defecated in the open. He's not had access to a toilet. And to see that even children are so intact as human beings with that kind of condition, I think should move us all into action. And so sanitation is a huge, huge, huge problem. Open defecation is mind-blowingly big here. And so we've been mapping data, looking, India is, we take the trophy in terms of open defecation by far. These are some statistics. Spark, who we were working with, said it's 1:800. The BMC said it's 1:150. The BMC's target ratio was 1:50, which means 6 families to 1 toilet, which means every morning you have a lottery and someone from the family is lucky and they get to go to, it's just like ridiculous that we have an aspiration that's so low. But of course, some of this was changed by our Prime Minister, who said he wanted to construct a toilet in every house by 2019. Now, we've got a few months to go, and I'm not sure this is going to be met. So that was ambitious, it was needed. But this is where I come in, and I'm not being critical of this aspiration. I wouldn't dare, not in today's world. But what I'm saying is, what I'm saying is that this is where we go back to the absolute solutions versus the transitionary solutions. We can't think in absolute terms. We will not find the solutions. These are wicked problems. These are problems that every solution will lead to another problem. And therefore, you have to think transitions. You have to think on the temporal scale. You have to think about reversibility. It can't be these magic bullets, which is what all of this is about. So you can't possibly have a toilet for every house in this landscape of Mumbai, because you have to solve the housing problem. The solutions to this lie not here. The solutions to Dharavi don't lie in Dharavi. They lie in how we can imagine the metropolitan region, how we can create. This is what New Bombay was all about in the 1960s when they were talking about it. We are talking about the same damn issues. It's mind-blowing. This is what they're doing, and the research has now shown some of it is successful, but some of it gets used to store jewelry and grain, because it's the most pakka thing in the village. And there's enough literature on this, so I'm not making it up. And there's some that have been successful. There's some cases where it's muscle. There are cases now that have been well documented by CPR and things where people are not given ration in the village unless they can prove they've built a toilet. So whether that's a good strategy in a democracy or not also becomes a question. But it all results from us thinking in absolute terms, and we have to break away from that. And as designers, we are equipped to look at spatial possibilities, and I think we can do it. So it's transitions before transformation. We can't make a transformation. So India's nuclear policy. We all were paranoid about it, but that was a transitionary solution that Manmohan Singh embraced, because he knew we couldn't jump from fossil fuels to renewables, our economy would collapse. And that was a way of making that transition. So transitions sometimes take you in directions that seem like you're going off the track, but it's a matter of how you can veer back to make that transition. And these become ways that we have to think, not in these singular, absolute solutions. So really, the community toilet we have to take more seriously, because that is the solution of transitions. And this is what the government does, which doesn't work because everyone defecates behind it. And so this is what we then, Spark had a grant from the World Bank, so we got involved with them to try to imagine this differently. How could it become a community center? How could it be not a monofunctional piece of infrastructure that gets related and associated to a toilet? How can you get people engaged with it in different ways? And so we came up with solar panels. We made a community center, which was the mistake, because this was, it was meant to be the house for the caretaker, but that is the lowest caste, and that didn't work well. And we said this could be the community center. We said, why not have flowers around the toilet? That it would be really successful if someone could pluck a flower for puja from the toilet facade. But that was all the mad idealism of an architect, and it was a complete mistake. So we tried building them. This was the first one in Chembur. At the plinth level, they stopped it, so I went to meet the municipal commissioner. He said, you must be mad, you're making an iconic building for the toilet. That's when I first understood what an iconic building means. So he said, no way. He said, we've already talked to a developer and we are doing an SRA scheme here. So your toilet, they'll all meet in the community center and there'll be an uprising and all this. So we went and built a smaller one, they stopped it. Then I said, let's choose a site where the roads are so bad, no municipal engineer will go. So we found one very close to the airport actually, and we landed up building one. Solar panels were intact. It worked really well for a while. The kids used the community space. That's public housing where they haven't moved into for 20 years because they prefer to live in the slums. And so therefore that just makes the point that I was saying. It was very simple bamboo slats. It worked very well. But then I went back 8, 9, 10 months later, and I can tell people what happened, but they abandoned and they built another one. And you know, the men started using this as to watch cricket matches. There's a little TV there, rum bottles, all that. And so this kind of got abandoned as a toilet. And so it, you know, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. Samuel Beckett comes to mind. And I think in these wicked problems, that's really the key. How as a community and a society of architects, we can keep learning from these failures as accumulative knowledge. And I go back to what I started the lecture with. How do we create these instruments for advocacy? So what I learned from this, I'm going to capture now this whole story and all the data. And there'll be young people here who have a starting point. Then you don't make the same mistakes. But we don't have that sharing. Unfortunately, us as a community, institutionally, we've broken down in terms of how that sharing happens. And I think we need to go back to that. And Pratap Bhanu Mehta said of these, which I think is worth thinking about. I'm quoting him now. He said, in a society riven by deep inequality, there's not even the minimal basis for mutual concern. Where social distance makes human beings almost a different species in each other's eyes, why would you expect anything else? Why would a contractor care if one of his construction workers used his hands rather than a brush to apply a dangerous chemical? The more inequality there is, the harder it is to imagine what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. It has to be admitted that even the most well-meaning, sensitive, find it hard to imagine what the suffocation, darkness, and sheer physical suffering of being at the bottom of a social hierarchy might really be like. The very thing you would expect to instigate the questions of justice actually makes it hard to even raise them. And so in these kinds of wicked problems, it becomes a moral question for many of us of how are we transgressing into this space? Are we really understanding and have true empathy for who we are trying to serve? And how do we make that connection? And it's a challenge we have to address, and therefore we have to be prepared for failure. Failure will be part of that process. And so I think it's worth embracing ourselves for that. So I'm just going to end by just a few very quick observations. I think, I think the challenge for us is Can we design this space of blur? What does this designing for transition mean if absolute solutions are not giving us the desired solutions? Can we use design and spatial manipulations to create and construct soft thresholds that facilitate porosity both socially and spatially? And so our approach has been, or our inspiration has been, to work in this context of democracy, to recognize its complexities, to unpack what the client even means, to see how we can actually intervene perhaps more appropriately to meet both traditional sensibilities but also contemporary aspirations, which I think that they become very important. And I think something that we are losing very much in India is the idea of pluralism. I mean, we should aspire to yet be a pluralistic society, that not only accepts differences, but also goes beyond to understand and even be influenced by difference in productive ways. And that's where the blurring of the binaries become important, because if we see the world and organize it just as binaries, we will actually create more polarity rather than synthesis. And so design, I believe, has a big role to play in this, because once the planner, the architect, the designer, the patron sees these various differences as being simultaneously valid, the challenge then becomes how to go beyond those polarized binaries through the making of architecture, soft thresholds and spaces that are visually porous, physically the adjacencies are manipulated in ways that can be productive, and most critically, I think they should be encompassing of the context. And therefore, us understanding what the context is becomes a first step. Don't take that for granted. Don't take what the client means for granted. Don't take what the context means for granted, because unpacking the context is your brief. The brief from the client of 2,000 square feet, 6 FSI, that's just one part of it. You can't make architecture from that. But you can make architecture by taking that brief, whether it's Vastu requirements, whether it's FSI, and stacking that context in its context. That gives you the brief. And that should be your role for the client. That's the service you provide to the client. That's the value that you provide to the client. And I think for us, that has been the inspiration of our practice. And I think we are, for many reasons, in a state of crisis in the profession for these reasons, whether it's the academy, whether it's practitioners, whether it's just our place in society. And it's a crisis. I define this as a crisis. And as Paul Romer from the World Bank once said, that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Thank you very much.